Hi everyone, Yvonne here with another episode for DevWidgets. This is the first in a series of videos that will build out a fully featured serverless application on AWS. Alright, so let's get started. When building out a new application, one of the first steps is to understand your business use case and kind of define what is your MVP and then decide on your architecture. So this video will do that, and the next videos will start developing and actually getting into the code. So what is the business use case? Let's say that a product manager comes to you and says, I need you to store some upcoming events and I need you to return that list of events when I ask you for it, right? And so you were saying, okay, well, who's going to be the consumer? Is it really just you? You know, can I store this in a flat file somewhere on my computer? And they're going to say, no. We actually want to store this somewhere behind some sort of communication layer. And maybe some of your front-end applications that might communicate with it is a mobile application and then let's say a browser. So your wheels start turning and you say, okay, so if it's a mobile application, my best bet is to have some HTTP connections. So I'm going to create a RESTful API. And a RESTful API is just like you see in your browser, there's a URL, and then when you hit that URL, it returns a JSON object. And we'll kind of talk about what that JSON object looks like. So those are some questions. As you go, you might have more questions. Like you might say, okay, what is an event? What kind of details, what kind of attributes does that event have? And so your product manager might say, okay, an event has basically date and time, and then maybe a description. And that description is some little advertisement blurb saying, hey, we're going to discuss cloud computing on video 123. And the date and time is tomorrow at 6 p.m. Okay, so we have a rough idea what the data is that we're storing, and we have a rough idea of who's going to be talking to us and consuming that event and how we'll talk back and forth. Now, I kind of want to spec that out. So usually the next step I do is I kind of draw it out. Usually I use a whiteboard. I'll use paper for this purpose because the whiteboard is very shiny. All right, so we are going to build a RESTful application. So what are we doing? We talked about that our product manager said that maybe a user might come to our site through maybe their phone, or maybe they might come to us on a computer. I'm not an artist, so you get the picture, right? We have a cell phone and a computer. And so how are they going to communicate to us? So we talked about it already. We're going to do some sort of RESTful API. But let's say for now, we're going to use an API gateway that will handle our requests. What would that URL look like? So you can imagine it's, mydomain.com/maybe event. And so event returns 1. Again, this is a RESTful API. And so maybe we have to give it an ID. So event 123 will return the details for that event. And then let's say, okay, we want all events, right? So then another URL might be events plural. And then let's take it another level, and maybe I might want to do something where I filter. So all the events where date is greater than some dates. So let's say 2020, 10, I don't know, 31 or something to that effect. And this can definitely get fancier. It might be something like, and date is less than, let's say 2020, 11, 30. It's supposed to be a dash. Okay, that's roughly what we're looking at. So a person either using a cell phone or a laptop communicates through these URLs to get event details. And we can assume that you understand that the program that's running on the browser versus your application on a mobile app, so whether that's Android or iOS, we can ignore that for now. For right now, we're going to be focused on the backend side of things, as that's what our product manager asked for. Once we get to API Gateway, we have these URLs. Where does it go, right? So we have to assume that after it gets to this, it has to go somewhere like a server, for example. So let's say we have a server, and this is what actually runs our code. And then again, we have to store details. So we have a database, for example. And so these URLs go to our server. Our server might do some sort of business logic, some sort of calculation before going to our database and getting that information. So now that we have this roughly spec'd out, let's talk about where this is going to actually be deployed. So personally, I love using cloud. I think it's one of the easiest ways. You don't have to worry about provisioning actual servers, what data center you're going to use. You don't have to figure out, okay, how much power do I need? How much space does my database need? On AWS or any of the other cloud providers, you can kind of start basic, start small, and then grow as you need. Personally, my expertise is AWS, so I'm going to use AWS. One other key detail, I'm also going to do serverless, and you might say, what does serverless mean? Obviously, I have a server here, so I'm fully cognizant that we need servers no matter what. But what makes serverless so powerful is that I can abstract that work out. I can give that work to AWS and say, okay, you figure out that operating system on that server. You handle, okay, how many CPUs it has, what kind of networking it has. You do all of that for me. I literally just want to give you some code and you run that code, and you allow my application to return a response, and then you give me that response. So the serverless service that we would use in this case for this piece is Lambda. So Lambda functions, literally you have code, you give it a jar, and that Lambda function with some minor configuration, like you set memory and a couple other details, they handle that and they run that application there for you. So the other piece that, again, managed service that we want to use and not have to worry about configuring our database is DynamoDB. So DynamoDB is NoSQL, or Amazon's flavor of NoSQL. It's basically JSON objects that or whatever kind of objects that I want to put in there. That gets stored to this key value pair database, and very basic configuration. I say, okay, how many connections do I want to deal with concurrently? So you configure your reads and your writes in DynamoDB. And then AWS handles other details of the underlying database. For the RESTful side, their API gateway is actually called API Gateway. We're going to use AWS's API Gateway here to define our REST side of the world, our resources, and then configure those resources to call our Lambda function, and then our Lambda function will then call DynamoDB to get our actual data. That at a high level is what our architecture will look like and how we'll handle the communication back and forth. Let's talk about actually the communication out of our Lambda. I'll tear this out. Let's switch pages here. What does our event actually look like? What is that response coming back? So in a JSON way, you are going to have curly braces. There's a date, colon, and then 2020 and 31. And then I think the time is 8 a.m., something to that effect. So that's attribute number one, date. And so the way JSON works is everything is in quotes, then we have a comma, and then we define our next attribute. And so the next one is description, colon, and then new awesome video about cloud. And then we close it with curly braces. So this is what our response would look like from our Lambda object out from API Gateway back to our browser or our mobile application. So I think this is a pretty solid design. I don't have any additional questions for our product managers, so let's actually define what are the steps here. The very first step that I like to do is I believe in infrastructure as code. I'm going to actually define all these resources with code. I'm going to store that with my application, and that kind of lets me make sure that if I need to destroy this, I can destroy this with one click and it will delete all these resources. If I need to deploy this application in like 2 or 3 different AWS accounts, I literally just have to run this one file. The service that we do that with on AWS is called CloudFormation. So the very first step that I would do here is define my CloudFormation. And so in that CloudFormation, I'm going to start basic, right? We just want a very basic infrastructure that, let's say, our Lambda returns hello world, just so that we can make sure that our infrastructure as code is functional. I'm going to have my Lambda function defined, my Lambda function resource, I should say, not necessarily the code here. And then we're going to have our very rough API gateway. And then we're going to have our actual code. I'm going to add this as a note here. It's going to return maybe some either hello world, or maybe it's going to return a stubbed event. Actually, scratch that. I'm going to return this stubbed. So this exact text as you see here, I'm not going to complicate my life, just so that we can test out our infrastructure. So once that's done, the next thing is actually building out our actual application that we want to run in our Lambda. And so because I want to focus on my MVP, I like to use a lot of tools, dependencies that kind of make life easier for me and figure a lot of stuff out. And so one of those libraries is Spring Boot. I will configure my Spring Boot application. It will have controllers, and those controllers will handle these REST APIs here. So there will be an API for the single use case for event, and then maybe another API that returns all the events. So I'll have my controller, and it's singular actually, but there's multiple APIs in the controller. And then I will do my app service. And one thing you notice here is I haven't talked about my DynamoDB table yet, right? For now, I'm probably gonna move this stub data into my app service layer. Okay, so once I have CloudFormation, I have my Lambda function API gateway. So I have the API gateway calling my Lambda function. My Lambda function is now wired together so that if you call event, it will return one stubbed event. And if you call events, it will return 2 stubbed or 2+ stubbed events. So now that that's there, now I'm going to get into the actual nitty gritty of DynamoDB. So DynamoDB config will go in 2 places. We have to add it to our CloudFormation template, and then we'll actually add it to our application, its domain layer. And so that will handle our application's communication would go to the domain layer. That domain layer would actually talk to DynamoDB and return the data that we're actually looking for. And so that's basically it. So here's our high level architecture diagram, what APIs we're going to expect, what resources we are going to use in AWS, what are we going to return, and then very rough steps on how we are going to build this out. Okay, we didn't really have any additional questions to our product manager as we go through this, as we start actually getting into the weeds. We might, right? Like we might just say, you know, this date and description is not very accurate. Maybe it needs to be time, date, description, or maybe there needs to be a title and a description. And those are kind of details that you start expanding on with a conversation, right? Because your product manager might say, you know what, for first rev, date and description is fine. Let's get this out the door. Once we get this out the door, okay, maybe we'll add these additional features and store that in DynamoDB. And maybe, you know, maybe this, he might say, or she might say, we don't need to do this advanced filtering of like date greater than whatever. Maybe that's not part of MVP and they just go and scratch that out. So a lot of things can change, but we have a rough plan here that we can follow. All right, so we talked a lot about what we're going to build. Let me talk about a couple things that you might want to have ready for the next video. One, have your IDE picked out, so your development environment. I personally use IntelliJ. My fingers know it inside and out. I love shortcuts, so if you change my IDE, I might be crippled and go a lot slower than the next person. Next thing is a basic understanding of programming. I'm going to be using Java in these applications, so definitely I would recommend that you also do Java, though I'm sure there's a ton of documentation out there that you can take the rough ideas that I go over with and then switch it to your programming language of choice. Next, basic requirement, you need to have an AWS account. They have a really great program where for the first year, a lot of resources are free, so this really won't cost much, if any, money at all for that first go around. The next thing you will want to have configured is SAM-CLI. That's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting around packaging our actual code to be able to then turn around and deploy it and deploy our CloudFormation for us. And so that's one less thing we have to worry about. Maybe I'll do a separate video and explain how that works and some of the other tools that folks use to be able to package their application. Last thing you're going to need is to be able to actually call a REST API, right? You're going to need to be able to use like something like curl. So you could do that terminal. IntelliJ has its own terminal in the IDE itself that you can use, or you can use Postman or something similar to be able to make your API request so that we can test this application as we go. So I really hope that you enjoyed this discussion. I hope that you have a better idea of what we're actually going to build. And then as soon as the next video comes out, you can get your hands dirty and start running wild. If you have any questions, please leave the comments down below. I'll definitely reach out to you and get an answer for you. If you had fun today, you want to learn more, definitely like, subscribe, and if there's someone you know that would enjoy this material, please definitely share them with them. And most importantly, as always, happy coding.